In a lonely grave, forgotten and unknown, lies the man who saved a president, and who, as a result, may well have preserved for ourselves and posterity constitutional government in the United States.
Escaped to Racine, Wisconsin, but he was soon arrested, beaten, and jailed by federal marshals. A young man named Edmund Ross joined a group of local citizens who stormed the jail, freed Glover, and sent him on his way to Canada. This was Ross's first public act as an abolitionist. Throughout his life, he was a man of conscience and a man of principle. In a few short years, he would perform an act as a U.S. Senator that would save a president and preserve the nation's system of government.
Courage, you mean somebody who's willing to go against the wishes of his constituents for what he considers the best interests of the country. Now, obviously, if you're going to have political courage, you have to take the consequences, and Ross did. Ross made a great contribution to our system and at his own personal loss.
In May of 1856, Edmund and his wife Fanny, who had 3 children by now, were able to make the trip to Kansas. For Edmund, it was a major episode because he would lead an entire wagon train of like-minded people to Kansas. The trip took 88 days through uncharted terrain, always avoiding hostile Missouri, which was a slave state. The struggle for a free Kansas was a holy war for abolitionists. For the Ross family, slavery was immoral. They didn't want it in Kansas, and they didn't want it anywhere. They hoped that within their lifetime they could see freedom and opportunity for slaves under the law. They were willing to sacrifice to leave a comfortable lifestyle and travel west to fight for it.
Most important of the early elections was the spring of 1855. It was an election for the territorial legislature. And the result of the first election was that although the territorial census had shown there were slightly fewer than 3,000 eligible voters in the territory, pro-slavery candidates to the legislature got elected with majorities of 5,000 and 6,000 votes. Northerners cried fraud. And
Ross joined the Kansas Free State Army as a volunteer, carrying a musket as a private soldier. He fought in the Battle of Hickory Point against pro-slavery forces from Missouri. By late 1856, Edmund Ross and his brother William would begin to fight their battles with words. They purchased the Kansas Tribune and launched their first issue as co-editors, their editorials always dealing with Free State issues. They were becoming important leaders in the Free State movement. This has blasted the absurdity of Kansas entering the Union as a slave state. In June 1859, Ross was elected as a delegate to the Wyandotte Constitutional Convention. Because Republicans dominated the convention, Kansas was easily made free. It became a state on January 29, 1861. Had it not been for the stubborn and dramatic resistance of the Free State Party and its leaders, especially men like Edmund Ross and his brother, and their willingness to fight and even die for the cause, Kansas could not have been admitted to the Union as a free state. Believed that the slave states of Maryland, Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri could be reasoned with, and convinced not to secede. With the Civil War going poorly, the president issued a national call for 300,000 volunteers. Edmund Ross was 35 years old, and although he had a large family to care for and a business to run, he issued a call to action through his newspaper. In the Union Army as a major in August 1865, after 3 years. All he wanted to do now was return to his family, operate a printing business, and publish his own newspaper. But he had no money and barely had a home he could call his own. In a letter, advocated suffrage for freed slaves as their most important weapon of self-defense. One of his early editorials was, in the meantime, a deep chasm was unfolding in Washington between President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, and a radical Congress. It was a chasm into which Edmund G. Ross was soon to fall.
Men in Lawrence to condemn the Reconstruction policies of President Andrew Johnson. By speaking up, what mattered to Ross was that he do the right thing. In just 2 years, that same mindset would lead to the most crucial public decision he would ever face, a decision that would dramatically affect his life and the history of the country.
A man without political experience now embarked on his new role as a member of the United States Senate, a challenge which no doubt energized him, but would also keep him from his family for long periods of time. As the United States Senate addressed the vexing issue of Reconstruction after the Civil War, its most junior member, Edmund G. Ross, rose to give his very first speech.
We have with us the widowed and orphaned ones of this war. Remember that it was by this great affliction that this country was saved, that they stood in the breach of the Republic and her foes, and we will be true to them.
Speaker, unless Congress proceeds at once to do something to protect these people from the barbarians that are now daily murdering them, I ask you and every man who loves liberty whether we will not be liable for the just censure of the world for negligence or cowardice.
Senator refused to say how he would vote. He knew the consequences of voting to acquit. It was made abundantly clear to him by Republicans in Washington and by constituents in Kansas that he would never be reelected to the Senate if he voted to acquit.
By his colleagues that a vote for acquittal of the president would mean his political death. Heavy pressure was brought against him by important figures in Kansas demanding that he vote to impeach.
Into my open grave. Friendships, position, fortune, everything that makes life desirable to an ambitious man were about to be swept away by the breath of my mouth.
A death-like stillness then enveloped the chamber. As the voting unfolded, only Ross's vote was needed to obtain the 36 votes necessary to convict the president and remove him from the White House.
Millions of men cursing me today will bless me tomorrow for having saved the country from the greatest peril through which it has ever passed, though none but God can ever know the struggle it has cost me.
He thought the grounds for impeachment were inadequately drawn, and therefore that it was unconstitutional. So if you're going to have political courage, you have to take the consequences, and Ross did. Neither Ross nor the other 6 Republicans who voted against the impeachment of Andrew Johnson of the opposite political party were ever returned to the Senate again. Ross lived in humiliation and disgrace for the rest of his term. He was beaten up physically.
And the others had sold their votes for greenbacks. But there is no tangible evidence to support such charges. It is true that Ross recommended several appointments to the president, but it was common for senators to do so. 2 years in the Senate, Ross argued urgently for the passage of the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act.
Slavery.
The most significant accomplishment of Ross's terms was the establishment of the Agricultural University at Las Cruces, the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and the School of Mines in Socorro. It was
his days to writing about his experiences in government, and in 1896 completed a major work titled History of the Impeachment of Andrew Johnson, President of the United States.
If the Johnson had been impeached, it would have meant that the Congress would have become more dominant than the executive, which I think we want equal branches, not one where the Congress is stronger. So that I think that Ross made a great contribution to our system and at his own personal loss.
Resolved that we commend and approve the mission to the Honorable Edmund Gibson Ross with the most universal approval of his vote, which saved the state and nation from disgrace, and that we send to him our cordial invitation to return to the state and enjoy the distinction brought about by said vote.
During the Cameron visit, Ross enjoyed a horseless carriage ride around town with Cameron and his old friend Elias Stover. Among their destinations was a major public reception in their honor.
Father enjoyed the music, applauding heartily, but as to the congratulatory speeches, he comprehended little. For his own gratification, the turning point of the tide of public opinion had come too late. He once told me
he had died a poor man who stayed true